I just want to make a couple of very brief introductions, and then we'll go right ahead into the lecture, and then Q&A with all of you in a roundtable format afterwards. If you don't know me, my name is Valerie Nelson. I'm here as the organizer of this event for the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, the sponsor here, and I'll help Charles with Q&A after his lecture. So the title, as you all saw, is Coastal Housing and Marshes and Other Green Spaces. And this could not be a more timely topic, especially for Gloucester. If you're not aware, the city of Gloucester is midway through an update to its housing production plan. They've identified the needs, demographic, cost of housing, and they have not yet entered the phase of developing recommendations for solutions. So this event is right at that pivot point where Charles will speak about an opportunity to think about bigger, more transformative ideas about how to manage our housing and our ecosystems along the coast. And hopefully, all discuss it together, some of these ideas that are forward-looking and reflect the need to take account of extreme storms and climate change, et cetera. It's an opportunity when we can think bigger in the housing arena. And so the timing couldn't be better. And there's a flyer in the back, amongst others. Community event about the housing process is here on Monday, March 23rd. And if things come out of this meeting for you and other thoughts about housing, I encourage you to come to that. So our speaker is Professor Charles Waldheim of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He'll introduce the amount of work that he's been doing up here with his many faculty and postdocs. Let me just say that this goes back to 2020, and it's been remarkably eye-opening and informative for us, and this is another opportunity for him to present that work. So, Charles, you said you might give your little bio and introduce the 20 years of work and this particular presentation.
Thanks, Valerie. Nice to see everybody. Old friends and new. Thanks for coming out. I don't know about you. I find today kind of beautiful. I mean, I know it's an acquired thing, I suppose. But yeah, as Valerie mentioned, I'm an architect academic. I'm at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and we have a research group called the Office for Urbanization, and our work is helping folks think about change in the built environment. We work with governments, NGOs, community groups. Want to dial this up? Is that you? Check 1, 2. Okay. Thanks. So we work with folks to help them think about change in the built environment, right? We do this with partners. We've been, over the course of the last decade or so, focused on climate adaptation on the Atlantic seaboard, with a particular focus on the Gulf of Maine over the last 6 years, and this one collaboration here. And I should begin by saying, we've been at this a while, but of course, the information that we have is what we've had available. We've been focusing on this for some time now. But I'm here today speaking on behalf of my research group. The recommendations that we're making are ours. They come from the findings and the research we've done with colleagues across campus at Harvard, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any of our partner organizations here. The other thing to say, of course, is the future of Cape Ann will be decided by folks like you on Cape Ann, right? So my job is to, be up to speed on the best available knowledge in this space, to do our due diligence, do our rigorous research, and try to understand the challenges that we're facing, and then to try to, illuminate those conditions in a way, share that with you. But at the same moment, of course, we will inevitably be in spaces where we won't all agree. I don't imagine that Cape Ann is of one mind on any of these questions. These are, challenging questions in any context. Another note here is that the work that we do is developed through scenario planning. scenario planning as a way of thinking about the future that the IPCC and other organizations in the climate space have been endorsing as a way to think about change. The goal of scenario planning is not to predict the future. The goals of scenario planning include trying to understand the secondary and tertiary effects, these kind of complicated interrelationships between systems in civil society that are not always immediately apparent. And in that context, it's also important to understand that we can never fully or adequately imagine what's going to happen in the future. We're projecting forward from conditions observed, what's in the literature over the recent and in fact, the distant past. And of course, I want to acknowledge the loss of the fishermen here earlier this winter. It's been a tough winter, obviously, and it's a long story in this part of the world, but it's also an important one for us to be mindful of. Most of what I'll share with you this afternoon has been published already. It exists as a PDF that's free to download. It exists on our publicly facing website, officeforurbanization.org. I'll share that URL with you later on. And over the course of the past several years, we've been doing a number of phases of work with different foci in different topics. And Valerie's invited me to say something about housing in relationship to landscape ecology, ecosystems. On the one hand, those are distinct topics, and we could easily fill a day on either one of them, but they are interrelated in ways that we find compelling in the context of climate resilience planning. We are just now in the office distilling a set of kind of executive summary recommendations from the 6 years of work. That's not yet published, but I thought I would start there. Now, these are very, very broad categories of thought. We have, as Valerie will remind me, thousands of pages of research and quite a lot of expert advice, and it's a little bit of what we do. Having said that, that advice has to then be meaningful to some of you or to others here on CACC to be useful or to be shared going forward. Among the things we think about are the relationship between the municipalities and how they might begin to collaborate. They are already doing this on a variety of fronts. We endorse that and recommend that they do more of that. It's important that we think of the landscape ecologies on Cape Ann as something productive, helping to produce resilience, and yet they also need our support. They're under great strain. Building increased communication and decision-making support across the municipalities. The threats associated with climate adaptation are not shared alone by individual municipalities, but are in fact shared across the entire Gulf of Maine. Among the things we'll be talking about today has to do with looking at land use, housing policy in relationship to the climate lens. That's not always the first lens. Our recommendations look at integrating water system and providing a more thorough understanding of the water system and its vulnerabilities. Among our recommendations, we advocate for coastal migration and the ability for ecosystems to move around in space and time. That's not always so easy to do in the context of land use, planning, and the like. And then we also have advice about how to think about finance and who might pay for the kinds of adaptations that might be required in the future. It's also important for us to encourage us to experiment in pilot projects. In addition to studies and plans and meetings with good folks like y'all, it's important that we try a few things and experiment in ways that are safe to fail. We are interested in waste and materiality as a part of that resilience strategy. And that ultimately, stewardship, civic participation, and a sense of equity with respect to these decisions. The built environment is most often as a result of a series of power relationships. And any new threat like climate adaptation will raise questions of equity, who's in the room making those decisions. What we begin with is the notion that individuals and institutions are already making decisions informed by the climate threat. At the same time, Gloucester's built on granite. It's been here for a very long time. It'll be here for a very long time. And you have enormous assets and resources, including a very literate and engaged civil society, among other things. So in our phase 3 work, we looked at 3 things: housing, ecosystem services, and infrastructure. We'll focus on 2 of those in our conversation today. The notion that Gloucester and most of Cape Ann has been built on granite kind of belies the fact that it's the extremity of living on the coast that's a part of the desire here, right? It's a part of the world that was settled from the coast, and it's a part of the world in which people desire to live in extremity in relationship to the Gulf of Maine, and that's not going to go away anytime soon. But as a result, the settlement pattern, the ways in which Cape Ann has been settled, produce a whole range of extreme conditions, right? So this is an aerial view from the east looking west from over Rockport looking back. You can see the map showing almost every building on Cape Ann. And highlighted in that yellow are the US FEMA flood zones. That's a crude measure, but it's one measure that we might use to think about extremity. Now, given that the populations, much of the residential and much of the residential value, I mean that both in economic terms, but also in lived experience and meaningful place, are drawn to the edges, and many of those edges are sitting on fill. So we begin, again, quite naively with the idea that there are nearly 1,400 residential structures today that are in the flood zone. I don't want to make a value judgment about that, but it's empirically observed. It's unlikely that that will get any less extreme going forward as sea levels rise, as storm events increase. Among our recommendations, of course, would be let's stop building in the floodplain. That's easy for me to say. I'm over-invested in real estate in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so I don't really have a portfolio to invest here. But, among the recommendations we make is let's stop putting housing in the wrong spot. I've come to know among the 48 or 52 beaches that there are around here, people identify themselves not by which town they pay taxes in, but which beach they go to. And if you look at the relationship between housing and the beach and the marsh ecosystem behind them, you can begin to see the dialectic here. On the one hand, we are drawn to the coast. That's where our lived experience is. That's where our property values lie. And increasingly, those properties are under threat. They're under stress already. We know that reinsurance markets are already beginning to price in costs associated with climate change and the like. And so there's a particular nexus, a set of relationships here that are not unique to Cape Ann, but would be the way that I would start to think about the conditions that are here. One study we've done here, we're calling this scenario enhancing individual agency. It gets at a nexus of a set of conditions. We know that Cape Ann does not have an abundance of housing. We know that that housing stock is relatively limited. I've just said don't put any more in the marsh, so that's my problem. That's my fault. At the same time, we know that there is a greater and greater demand for housing, but also a desire to keep Cape Ann as it is, to not grow, to not build density, and therefore housing costs go higher and higher, both sale prices and rentals. And in the context of climate adaptation, what we've done is we've studied a range of different kinds of climate scenarios, including a range of different storm events. So if you picture climate going forward, sea levels are rising, storm events are increasing, these things become, in a way, built into the life of living here. You've all been living with nor'easters for time immemorial, right? So as that increasing, cost of, living with the water continues, what's likely to occur, based on the study that we've done here and informed by conditions elsewhere, what's likely to occur is that the increment of those storms will increase, and as they do, there will be a moment where it's going to be difficult for some people to rebuild in place, right? Now, on the one hand, it's almost impossible for any elected or appointed official in our political economy to prevent people from rebuilding where they are. Right. We know that after, Katrina in New Orleans and after Sandy in New York, people that had houses that were built in the wrong place are flooded out. It's almost impossible to keep them from rebuilding there politically, maybe even ethically. We can talk about that. Having said that, we know the places that are likely to flood. So in this study, what we looked at would be who are the most vulnerable, right? The most vulnerable are the people that are already rent burdened. These are the people who would maybe not be able to be moving back into the apartment or the house that was being rented because it's not yet rebuilt, right? And in that space, we're interested to study, well, where would they be forced to relocate to, right? So in this scenario, in the wake of a storm event, if it takes a year for a landlord to rebuild, even if they are insured, that displacement we've seen in other storm events elsewhere, that displacement is something that we can study quite empirically. And while the vast majority of these folks will not leave New England, it's also increasingly true that it would be challenging for Cape Ann to absorb them, right? And so a part of that thinking, a part of our advice to you folks is, We understand the desire of keeping Cape Ann as it is, but you already have questions of, environmental justice and questions of social equity around housing, and that adding housing would be one of our primary asks of you. Again, that's easy for me to say. I don't live here. I don't deal with the costs of traffic and the additional sewerage and all of the demands that additional housing will require. Having said that, as a part of your resilience strategy, think of it this way. You can either increase your housing capacity and its resilience and its volume, or you can imagine that the cost, the social cost, the economic cost, the physical cost of increasing storm events going forward will mean that not all people that want to live here will be able to. Our work has been informed by a number of partners, a number of thought leaders here on Cape Ann over many, many years. And on our website that I'll share with you at the end, you can go see a couple of videos that we've made kind of documenting that condition. On the one hand, it's easy to talk about climate threat, but at the same moment, we don't see climate changing immediately on a day-to-day basis, so it can be quite invisible. So thinking about change over time is something that we do often, and at the same moment, being mindful of how resilient this place has been, right? My guess is that you will be able to live here quite successfully for a very, very long time. But the question is, well, in what ways? What's likely to change relative to how we live here? And in this case, it's not just our opinion, but many of the thought leaders, many of our thought partners here on Cape Ann have, confirmed for us that there's a relationship between housing and the quality of landscape amenity, the quality of landscape ecology that's here. Part of our work has been informed by this synthetic or future storm event from 2038 that we modeled. Again, that's a scenario planning exercise. I don't wish any ill on anyone. I come from Florida where we have hurricanes all the time. It's not something I wish here, but it's a way of thinking about the relationship between climate adaptation efforts, resilience efforts, and the impacts that we can expect. So I'll say a little bit here about how we do the work that we're doing. Context of housing, the housing that are the most vulnerable to flood. I've mentioned already 1,300 structures in the FEMA floodplain, almost 2,500 structures on Cape Ann that are below the design elevation for flood in 2070. Now, 2070 is a ways off. What are we, 2026, right? So even if you talk about a 30-year mortgage, that's well beyond the scope of a 30-year mortgage. Having said that, what we see in the literature, what we see happening across the country is individuals and institutions, markets, policymakers, they're already making decisions on very different timelines. And that's one of the sources of friction often, is that we have on the one hand somebody that's lived in this house that their family has had here for generations, and their tax burden is increasing by virtue of needing to pay for resilience measures, increasingly vulnerable infrastructure, and the like. We have new residents, people that are flocking here for the quality of life. Maybe they're moving here to start a business. Maybe they want to start a family. But we also have renters who are disproportionately burdened with the costs of rent. And so in that mix, we have insurance markets and reinsurance markets. We have policymakers here locally in the State House, in Boston, in D.C. And in that mix, what we see through a variety of measures is that the limitation on the volume of housing and the quality of housing that's here is not going to get any easier anytime soon, is our sense of it. There are also a number of social vulnerabilities. The evidence is quite clear that the populations that survive extreme weather events, the populations that are the most resilient, are not necessarily the wealthiest ones, nor the ones that have done the most conversations like this, but they are the ones that maintain societal relationships and social bonds at the neighborhood level, right? That's, again, a recommendation, but at the same moment, it's already something that you benefit from here in large measure, in my experience. I don't want to overgeneralize from that, but to the extent we can address social vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities around housing and people that are rent burdened, people that don't have access to adequate health care, people that don't have adequate food, if there's food insecurity. Each of those measures seems separate from climate, seems separate from housing, but as they accumulate, we know that those vulnerabilities will be revealed in the stress of climate as it's changing, increasing weather events, increased extreme weather events, and the like. It doesn't get any better, I'm sorry. Another threat, has to do with gentrification, right? As property values go up, as tax rates, continue to be what they are, the desirability of living on Cape Ann is not going to diminish anytime soon, in spite of these challenges. And that means that gentrification, in its purest sense, of course, is reflecting the kind of desirability of the place, right? On the one hand, I'm not going to say that it's a good thing, but I'm just going to say it's a condition in a housing market that we should be aware of and be attentive to. There's also a form of what's been described as climate gentrification. This has to do with the fact that oftentimes, the people that first developed here didn't do the development in the wetland, right? They didn't build in the floodplain. They built up on top of the rock, and that's not a bad thing. But it does mean that if your properties of a certain value, if your physical plant, your infrastructure of a certain duration occupy that privileged position, they're likely to maintain and oftentimes increase their value, right? Because they're more insulated, relatively speaking. And those parcels that are more vulnerable, right? So that form of climate gentrification is also with us. What we see is that if we isolate the housing market per se, enormous inequity, a lack of affordability, increasing pressure on having access to adequate housing here that's affordable. But at the same time, it's the infrastructure that are shared between those different residential forms that, of course, becomes quite vulnerable, because it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you live on top of the hill or down in the floodplain, there's still only two bridges and a roundabout, right? So in that context, what we share, three? Oh, the railroad bridge, thank you. Let's shout out for mass transit. So in that context, we've done quite a lot of work, and I'll not go into the detail about all of it here, but we've done a lot of work looking at, well, if we think about housing and the regeneration of housing on Cape Ann, like what are the options available? This work has been informed by a range of experts. You see here quotes by Jason Beckfield, who's a sociologist, colleague of mine at Harvard, or Jesse Keenan, who's an expert in climate and finance from Tulane University. And among other things, what they've been recommending, and a part of what we're recommending, is that we try, among other things, to diversify the types of housing that are available, right? In American housing, by and large, there is for some time now been a concern about the so-called missing middle, that overwhelmingly residential development in our culture has been individual single-family homes and larger, higher density developments. And that's in part a logic of the marketplace. It's the logic of development that is in those two increments of mass production. And the so-called missing middle has to do with a range of other, lower or medium density housing types. In this context, the amassed value of residential properties in the floodplain is in the billions of dollars, you might imagine. So there's a financial or economic vulnerability. And then if you look in various climate scenarios at the vulnerability of the tax base, given that the municipalities themselves are drawing largely their revenues to be able to respond and to maintain services and health and life safety, they're drawing those resources largely from property values, right? In that context, the vulnerability of housing is not just a social equity question, it becomes a finance and governance question fairly quickly. Jesse Keenan, among others, has been quite vocal. He's got a new book out called North. I recommend it to you. He's among the most, I think, well-informed and articulate voices on these topics. Suggests that as the costs for maintaining city services, maintaining infrastructure in the face of increasing weather events will mean that those vulnerable populations, as they're pushed out, will often find themselves unable to secure housing in the places where they've lived, and that has this effect, which is negative in terms of community resilience. Another thing that we'll talk about often has to do with the relative inclusion of those populations in decision-making, right? And you all know much more about the political economy here on Cape Ann than I do. Having said that, what we've seen and what we can report, which we think is true, is there's not a high level of trust, let's put it that way, between many of the community members that we speak with and their elected and appointed officials. And without making any value judgment about that, we can simply report that, we see elected and appointed officials at each municipality and each level of government, state and federal, who are, working hard and are committed to addressing the challenges here. And at the same moment, the lack of trust or the lack of a history of trust between folks in the community something that comes up all the time. You, as I say, you will know more about it. You can share more about that in the conversation. A part of this has to do with the relationship between the municipalities and the state, right? I just watched Ken Burns' Revolutionary War, movie. I was fascinated by the fact that he was asked, you've been doing this for 30 years, Mr. Burns, like, why is it you never dealt with this war of all wars? And he said, well, there were no photographs. Okay. And somehow, after doing this for 25 years, he found that they were paintings. I don't know what your reception of that film has been, but I am aware that everybody around here is armed, or has been historically, and has a long tradition of independence. I'm not here on behalf of the state of Massachusetts or on behalf of the State House, certainly. But what I can report is that, of course, as the state, gives mandates and proclaims what the future should be, individual municipalities, each locality will respond in their own way. My observation from the outside has been is that Gloucester in particular, Cape Ann more generally, has had for a number of years all sorts of carve-outs and exceptions. That's not unusual. Like, this is often the case, is that every place is exceptional in its own way. And at the same moment, the tools that I see, the state rolling out to look at adaptation and coastal adaptation in particular, their mandates for plans, their mandates for housing, what I see often is that they land in a way that seems incongruous often. It seems to produce as much friction or tension, whereas if the desire would be for us to be able to house more people on Cape Ann in a more resilient, sustainable way, in a greater sense of social equity, for whatever reasons, the recent proclamations coming out of the state don't necessarily seem to have aligned with that, or they have not yet produced the kind of housing response that one might have imagined. Again, you'll know more about that. Of course, another thing to note here has to do with the very particular political configurations in the three towns and the one city. They're very different, and we'll talk more about that difference as we get into the detail. While the climate risks might, impact all four of them, their own particular histories, their cultures of political action, their own forms of governance are, of course, relevant here as well. I don't know to what extent any of you have been following the discourse on abundance. In our circles, this is a topic that's been timely for the past year or two. Ezra Klein of the New York Times, Derek Thompson, formerly of The Atlantic, have co-authored a book using that title. And their argument that it is basically, in the U.S. in the recent years, liberals have been quite good at the press release. They've become expert at the ribbon cutting or at the signing of the giant cartoon check. But when it comes to actually building things, it's very, very difficult. I'll leave you to the book if you find it of interest. Among the things the book argues is that in our own political formation in this culture, almost any of us are invited to litigate almost anything, right? Our system is not set up with the judiciary to make judgments as to quality or social equity or environmental resilience. Rather, proposals are made, plans are made either by private actors or public actors or sometimes in collaboration, and then almost any individual can then litigate to stop that. And we've become very good at putting filters in the way, right? So whether it's the 1970s Clean Air and Clean Water Acts or a whole range of decades and decades of environmental or other forms of policy, it's clear in the climate space that many of those policies, many of those well-intentioned, legal frameworks are quite challenging now because it makes it very difficult for us to build at scale, right? If you take simply the desirability of renewable clean energy, for example. One of the first things I learned on Cape Ann, even before I got here in the context of COVID in 2020 when we were doing this all via Zoom, was don't talk about windmills. And I said, well, my notes from our first meeting say you want to talk about, climate sustainability and renewable energy, but we're not going to talk about windmills, right? So abstracting out from Cape Ann for a minute, if you look at the kind of regional electric grid or even further afield, there is abundant geothermal, there's abundant wind, we have some solar capacity, and we've done studies in each of those areas. But who builds the grid? Who makes that investment is a kind of open question. And among the ironies are the places that are maybe more traditionally red-leaning states are building at a much faster rate than we are in blue states or blue towns. So in that context, Texas, for example, is building out a lot more renewable energy. Again, I don't want to make a value judgment about that, but what I want to suggest is that the ability to have a resilient energy network, the ability to move away from fossil fuels, away from carbon-based economy, it's not necessarily clear to me, given our present political climate, that seems quite likely in the near term. In response to the let's not talk about windmills, my view has been, if Cape Ann could decarbonize your economy tomorrow, if somebody could flip a switch and say we have no more carbon in our economy, you would still be affected by the downstream impacts of it globally, right? Because what's in the climate in terms of energy, what's going to be in the climate in terms of energy going forward is not going to be at the scale of Cape Ann, right? Because you're downstream from all of those forces. And of course, decarbonizing your economy is certainly something we would advocate for. Having said that, increasingly in the spaces that I'm in, it has much more to do with preparing for adaptation and managing adaptation in a way that you feel good about, or at least are prepared for in a way. Another thing that we found is that each municipality is approaching these things in different ways, and there's quite a lot of detail here. I won't go into it, but again, you'll be more expert on the lay of the land day to day here than I would be. That's not necessarily a problem. It's probably a good thing. And in fact, the question for us is not so much about regionalization, but rather what are the forms of communication, on what topics will we share, right? On what topics might we work together? In 2015, 2016, at my employer, I was invited to teach a course along with some other faculty on municipal response to climate change. So this was with faculty of law, engineering, planning, and myself as an architect urban designer. We had students for each of those areas. And I, optimistically, as I intend to do, show up thinking, well, it's about gravity and water, and I'm not a fluid hydrologist, but it's physics, right? I mean, how hard is it? And weeks 3 through 8 were all about reinsurance markets. I should learn about reinsurance markets because they're all connected. In that course, we were inviting students and faculty to imagine, what are the governance scenarios what are the precedents for this kind of thing in New England? What are the exact, kind of precedents that we might look at? And I was unprepared for the winning case, which was the Massachusetts Tollway Authority. As a newcomer to New England, I hadn't had a lot of experience with the Tollway Authority. I mean, I drive on the road, but I didn't really understand. And what they were arguing, these are Harvard Law students, they were saying, well, the reinsurance markets will absorb this to a certain point. The Commonwealth requires us to underwrite mortgage insurance for everybody. It doesn't matter if it's your third house, on Cape Ann, you still have the same market. And that market will hold together for a period of time, and we'll just learn to live with the water. The back bay will flood and we'll pump it out, and it's going to be fine, basically. Having said that, if you look at, the dam on the Charles River has about 18 inches of freeboard left, and eventually there's going to have to be another regime of dam building if the Charles River or if the mouth of Boston Harbor is to be maintained. And if you think about that in a cascading set of choices, I know that our friends on the Cape and Islands, the other Cape Cod and the islands, they already have groups and they're working on things, and that was a part of the initial call to us, was like, we're seeing other groups mobilizing, thinking about this, and there's not a lot of work being done on Cape Ann. Why aren't you up here working on this? So in that context, the Tollway Authority emerged for those students and faculty in part because it had a kind of ability to produce revenue, which is going to be needed, but it also had a kind of extra jurisdictional, it didn't overlay precisely with any one layer of government exactly, right? So it's not a regional government, it's not a new county mandate, it's a kind of overlay in a way that has some financial capacity in a certain technical area. So that's something that we've thought about and you might think about. We have in the report that you can see, and you can visit the website, and we're happy to share the PDF with you, finance and the way to think about finance in the context of preparing for climate adaptation. Obviously, each place is different, but at Jesse Keenan, among others, along with my colleague Rachel Meltzer, who's a planner at the GSD, have looked into this here and have looked at the relationship between the housing stock, the tax base, and the various scenarios that they see, both elsewhere in the United States and here on Cape Ann. They are of one voice arguing that in addition to more housing, Cape Ann has the capacity for and should encourage some greater commercial development. Again, not everyone here is going to love that idea. It's easy for me to say. Having said that, without the growing of the tax base, what we see both in the literature and in the precedents in other places is it's very difficult to pay for resilience projects. It's very difficult to pay for climate adaptation unless we focus on growing those tax bases and tax revenues. So whether it's an overlay of something like the Massachusetts Tollway Authority and a new kind of climate resilience overlay, mechanism, or it's the growth of commercial development and or the growth of housing, either or all three of those things are ways that are available going forward. Of course, we can appeal to the state, we can appeal to private philanthropy, we can appeal to the federal government, but in that context, our authors, our experts would recommend thinking maybe more locally and often seeing a mix of those things. It's not as though there's going to be one single project. And in that context, the other thing that we're stressing in our work is that there's not going to be a single big plan, right? Individual actors, agents, institutions are already making choices and making decisions. In that context, it's not as though the public sector has the only responsibility. They do have a particular special set of responsibilities to health, safety, and welfare and thinking about the future in a fiduciary way. And when the private sector is more focused, quarter to quarter or year to year on a certain kind of bottom line thinking, the public sector does have a set of responsibilities in that regard. But they're not the only actors by any means, right? Private philanthropy will play a role, the growth of the tax base through commercial development in a smart way, the growth of housing, all of these will play a part. We've also spent quite a lot of time talking with folks, thinking about, well, how do we communicate with each other about this? How do we talk about these things? And as we said before, we've seen not a lot of trust, not a lot of faith in the communication channels that are available. I don't want to overstate that. It's highly variable, municipality by municipality, different issues arising. But at the same moment, we have a set of recommendations here about best practices from other places. This is Jason Beckfield, the sociologist, about in other contexts, how might we get that social capital back, right? If your ability to respond to extreme weather events and climate adaptation threats will be based on your social resilience. That's not just knowing your neighbors, it is that, but it's also to what extent do we trust our elected and appointed officials to represent us in a moment of crisis. All of those things are quite evident in the literature and in the precedents that are studied here. There are a number of case studies in the work that we've done, none of which are precisely symmetrical or applicable to the situation here, but many of which can shed light, and I won't go into detail here, but there are a number of case studies that have been examined in greater detail that we might be able to benefit from. We're looking here particularly at examples in the US that have something comparable that might be relevant here. And we've organized recommendations around housing under these three areas of kind of governance, finance, and community engagement. How do we talk with ourselves about these things? Never have the drone footage when it's icy and snowy. It's always beautifully lit and somehow tidy. And another topic that we've been asked to look into has to do with ecosystems, landscape ecology. That's also an area that is, of course, related to climate adaptation questions. It's related to the questions of housing. It's also one of the fundamental basis of the life here, right? It's a part of the beauty of the place. The value of being here over a long period of time. And of course, initially one could imagine that, well, those landscape systems, of course, they are lost at the expense of housing, right? That it's a zero-sum game. And in our experience, they are intertwined, but there are ways in which communities can think about change, can think about planning, make design decisions that can do both of these things. Oftentimes we imagine the natural world to be self-organizing, right? As if it was there in primordial times and it will always just be there. And if we just let it alone, it'll just be fine. And that's not our advice. These systems have already been highly engineered. They've already been changed over a very long period of intervention. And as the climate changes, they will need our help also. So our advocacy here is to use the best available science, look at the condition of these places, make some value judgments about what are the most desirable, the most important, what are the most meaningful, and make some judgment as to, well, where can we build? Where should we build in a way that's smarter? We begin again with where the water is. It's always a good place to start. The FEMA flood zones. This is the storm surge of a simulated 2030 storm surge projection. These are the places that get wet all the time. This is the 2070, so we're using 2030 2050, 2070 design flood elevations. And not surprisingly, they kind of build upon one another, right? If you subject this to a slosh model with an MIT hurricane scientist, as we did, you do get some interesting, weird secondary and tertiary effects that are kind of curious. But by and large, the places that have been filled historically will tend to get wet. They will tend to flood more often, and they will require more investment in those places. Another way of thinking about that is that the coastal erosion zone, or the kind of coastal edge, as it exists in different biomes, will be subject to different kinds of pressures, right? So if you see this kind of colored line around the edge of Cape Ann, we've kind of distilled that down to, in a kind of simple distillation of like 5 conditions, right? There's a kind of hardened edge harbor condition that's quite prominent here. There's a very important zone that's the granite coastline that's quite iconic and meaningful and important here. There's the sandy coasts and beaches, which are obviously equally significant here. There's the estuarine coasts, and then there's the coasts that have marshes and other kinds of emergent conditions, right? So in that menu, again, that's a fairly simple diagram, but it is a way that landscape ecologists will think about this place. Each of those different types of edges will exhibit different kinds of responses to increased weather events, increased storm events, and to flooding over time. Often, the way that we think about this in this kind of work is to zoom up in scale and to look at the ecosystems in which these amenities are embedded. In actual fact, in lived experience, the natural biomes, the forested uplands and the meadows and the beaches and the marshes and the granite coasts, they are connected to local and regional systems. But in actual practice, they've also been cut off and separated and zoned, and they're owned in a way that prevents them from moving more naturally, right? So about half of the beaches on Cape Ann have behind them a natural marsh system that, if allowed to migrate, to move, could migrate up with rising water levels in the Gulf of Maine. The other half, not so much. It's very difficult for them to move, and they will probably die. The marsh will die, and therefore the ecosystem supporting the beach will die. In that context, it's very, relatively easy to identify the vulnerabilities. The values, you know much better than I do, but we have done work on that as well. And in that context, another great asset, great strength you have is you've had a long history of conservation and management practices. You have a well-informed, literate, engaged public, and at the same moment, a number of non-for-profit NGO groups, people that are advocating on behalf of various species and various ecosystems, and that's an extraordinary set of resources. Not every place that we work has that, and we should bolster that and commit to it going forward. Again, we use the idea of a synthetic storm as one scenario planning exercise, not the only one. We know that if we look at Cape Ann and its economy, its lived experience, maintaining those beaches, knowing that the 48 or 52 of them or however many there are deeply held and loved by all of you, and that you identify yourself through your beach, there will have to be inevitably some choices that get made there, because not all of those beaches will survive over the course of the time between now and 2070. Of course, the models of sea level rise, the models of storm events are all, projections. Who knows? But we can say at a minimum that they are under increasing pressure. They also play a non-trivial role in the identity of the place, a non-trivial role in the economic viability of certain portions of the place. So we begin with beaches and their marsh systems, and many of our recommendations have to do with allowing those marshes to breathe more normally, to move to the extent that's possible. And again, the recommendation is let's stop building in the marshes to the extent that's possible. We use the term regenerative here because we want to stress that these things will not simply revert to some normal state on their own. They require our support. And sometimes that support means, fencing them off and letting them alone for a while. Sometimes that support has to do with a kind of management plan. The recommendations we have here include recommendations from a number of landscape ecologists and biologists, people that really study these systems in great detail. Another advantage here, you have extraordinary science, report after report and study after study of the species that are here, and you have extraordinarily unique landscape conditions, amazing emergent habitat. There is the challenge of a loss of biodiversity and a loss of habitat, but these things are soluble at the scale of Cape Ann, again, given good governance and a kind of among the recommendations that we're making is that among those spaces that are the most widely held or the most commonly cherished, let's take Dogtown Common, for example, that rather than a period of simply letting it sort itself out and hiding it from people, that some more active planning and management would probably be called upon, given the stress that it's under already, both from climate but also from its overuse. We believe that there are ways in which a few of those ecosystems benefit from more studied and planning, whether it's management toward conservation or other uses. As you know, you have already a number of overlay conditions in terms of zoning, and I won't get into the detail with respect to the water systems, but again, another asset that you have is you have extraordinary fresh water. You have it in abundance. You have it in systems that are relatively robust on the supply side. Wastewater, on the other hand, is less optimistic. It's fragmented. It tends to have a number of deleterious environmental impacts, especially the leach zone from residential development that's of a certain age. The lack of secondary wastewater treatment, the relative elevation of the wastewater systems you have already, all of those will be challenged going forward. One of the things that we noted, I'm not losing sleep on this issue in particular, but each of the municipalities think about open space in a slightly different way. Again, that's kind of normal, that's as it should be, right? You have your own thoughts and your own culture and your own history. And at the same moment, what we find is technically thinking of open space is such a broad category that we try to be a little bit more precise in thinking about the biologic function of the biome. Having said that, as you think about planning, in addition to thinking about housing and zoning and density, we would also ask that you think about, well, what aspects of open space planning can we use in a more forward-thinking way, right? That is, as opposed to simply setting it aside, how might we think about managing these spaces? That includes thinking about forestry practices. It includes thinking about maintaining agricultural production to the extent that's viable here. It has also to do with the idea of mitigating against fire hazard, among other things. Again, there's more detail about each of those topics here. As we did in the housing section, we look here at, well, how might we finance these things? What are the models that are available for thinking about paying for some of this stuff? And then how do we, talk to each other? How do we engage in civil discourse or conversation, discussion, or even decision-making? Among the things that you'll see on our website, we've produced a series of short documentary videos describing these ecosystems in greater detail that you might find of interest. And as in the housing section, we also have a number of case studies from other parts of the U.S. in which examples of how things got paid for, what they might cost, and how you might think about change going forward. So I'll pause there. You guys are so nice to come out on a Saturday. And I think Valerie and I will have a conversation. We'll take your comments and questions. Sound good? So most of what I've said here and all the work for the past 6 years can be found at capeannofficeforurbanization.org. You can also just send me an email, waldheim@harvard.edu, and I can send you a
What Charles and I were hoping for now was more of a community roundtable discussion, and I'm hoping to ask you all either a question you have for a lot of material presented by Charles, or your comments and your own thoughts about whether this was persuasive or where you see some real opportunities. And the value here is that other people in the room can hear what you say and vice versa. So let's see.
Thank you so much. I'm Jane O'Malley, and I live in Rockport. And over in Pigeon Cove, we have a big elephant in the room called the Cape Ann Tool Company. And I noticed it on your flood zone page. It's very much in that flood zone. I know the old timers, when I was a kid, would say there was a beach there, So anyway, it's frustrating to everybody, the lack of progress. And I know we have someone who was on the Rockport Concom and Planning Board here. And it's also exciting. We have a candidate for state rep, Andrew Tarr, here. So, it's not, I realize all these forces have to work together. And I'm glad you touched on it, because I don't know that as time goes by, and this has been for years, that it sits there, it seems less and less viable for a housing opportunity, and you kind of confirm that. But I look at like the Gloucester Genome Research Place in Gloucester on the waterfront and that blue economy, and I've always looked at Pigeon Cove Harbor like incredible opportunity there for an ocean-related business, and I have no idea what that would be, but jobs and not just for tourism, a year-round kind of thing, and training like the Gloucester Research Place, Genome. I always get the name wrong, but you know those kind of things excite me and inspire me, and then it just sits there. So I'm going on, but I don't know if you have any comments on how you get that to happen. You know, I don't even know who owns it and what they want to do and where they're stuck at this point. There's been so many things, but I know back in the 90s, I was involved in litigation because someone wanted to do a big cigarette boat operation there and have a gas tank at the mouth of the harbor, and that just didn't seem like a good thing. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks for that. I'm not sure in this context exactly what a cigarette boat is. It doesn't. I see. Very loud. I guess what I could say is, as you live here, you know, as you spend your lives here, you will see both over time, but also very rapidly, these changes in a way. And one of the studies that we did was advocating for the embedding of things like iNaturalist and other forms of, you know, kind of what we used to call citizen science or civilian, you know, kind of photography of these conditions. And I think the other point that I would stress is that these challenges and a civil society's response to them are not going to be one big program. You know, it's not going to be the New Deal or the Apollo moonshot. It's a lot of little things, right? It's a lot, and some are bigger than others. And so what I typically recommend people do is to try to find a project that, you know, can become a pilot they can start with, whether it's an economic development project or a housing project or a marsh resilience project. And in most places, the place that has the most traction, visibility, can generate enough interest will become pretty self-evident, right? When we looked historically at when there were state or federal, like public interventions on Cape Ann, apart from the regular roads and sewage and all these other things, most often it was addressing the fishing community in Gloucester's Inner Harbor. That was the one venue that historically has gotten the attention of the State House and the feds. And I'm not making a value judgment about that. We simply observed that. Among the studies we've done is we looked at the engineering feasibility and the cost of gates and damming either at the Inner Harbor or the Outer Harbor. And what we find is it costs about $1 million per building to protect, whether you do it inner or outer. And of course, the vast majority of the properties on Cape Ann are not protected. So by virtue of the geography here, you have enormous advantages with the granite outcroppings and the ability to retreat and a long history of living with the water. At the same time, the crenellation, the complexity of the coastline means, you know, a lot of folks, a lot of properties that are going to be changing. Rather than thinking about all of it at once, what I try to advocate for is identify with you and your folks, your elected appointed officials, your community members, what's the one project that we can do to at least start to think about this?
Charles, if I could follow up, I was going to ask you this anyway, on this question. Could you speak a little bit more about the term regenerative? Because even at one local spot, I think you were talking about the permanence versus change, that we tend to have one regulation or one goal at hand. You know, either it's a conservation thing or it's the fishing lobster boats in that cove or it's housing or whatever. And I tease out, if you could, a little bit what you mean by regenerative, because my impression is that we should be looking at multiple benefit projects that embody jobs and conservation. Am I right about that? Can you explain what you mean by regenerative?
Sure, yeah. So regenerative is it's a little bit of a wonky term. It's a kind of term of art that's used now to describe a kind of growth logic in which there's not a zero-sum game between, you know, open space versus housing, right? That in fact we need both of them. Regenerative in this context also suggests that there will be change over time. There always is. And in that change, a part of that is just normal change. And we simply think of the pace of change accelerating a bit in certain ways, right? So in that example, we advocate for investing in developing management for practices for and building more resilient ecosystems. And we've got some examples about how to do that. But in part, to pay for that, we probably need to find a way to build more commercial development and or more housing. And I know, there's been a tendency, not for everyone and not for all time, but there's often been a tendency to think, well, the landscape is going to take care of itself. It's natural. And if we simply stay out of its way, it's going to organize itself. But it's already under such pressure from overuse, the changing climate already. So regenerative, think of it as a kind of a healthy growth strategy in which there's not a zero-sum game between commercial development, housing, and landscape amenity.
Yeah, thank you for that. Les.
This is before any of us in this room was born. Okay? So in 1907, Gloucester was united to buy shares in the Cape Ann Therapeutarion at Wales-Draw Park. It was formed by the board of directors from the Gloucester Hospital, not Addison Gilbert, but the Gloucester Hospital. It was a spa for healthy people to go to, for rich people to go to, really not for residents of Cape Ann as much. It was oriented toward the steamship economy, toward people coming from Europe on a steamship into Boston or into Gloucester, and then going into the middle of Dogtown. Shares were $10 a piece. The word regenerative didn't appear. The word speculative scenario didn't appear. It went belly up in 1917 because by that time, the war had subsumed the global economy. So it's great that you asked the word regenerative. I'm struck by the words that are used to describe the difficulties now have replaced the decision, the business decision of 1907. What is the most important word other than regenerative to you?
Build more housing.
Okay.
I just have a comment. I mean, we're talking about pollution and regenerative and whatever. The concept, which is not, there's a lot of litigation on, but those that pollute should pay. So if you're a builder, whatever you're doing, is there a fund to protect the properties of others or whatever might happen? So, you're talking about developing businesses that might, we need more business. Well, we need more revenue to protect. So those that are planning on building or polluting or whatever should have a fund or should be liable. Just a comment.
I appreciate the discussion a bit about the fact that housing and business is all like on the coast or tends to be on the coast and probably remain that way. You mentioned something about sort of armoring the coast, building a dam, and that would be like $1 million per building to do that. Has there been any thought about elevating homes, for example, on stilts? And I think Florida's done this in some cases. Is that a practical solution, economically speaking? Would that help with that balance between open space and housing?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Tom. 2 points there. So yes, we do have a number of studies from around the U.S., and we've done some studies of parts of Cape Ann if they were to elevate the public realm. On the one hand, it's not rocket science, it's physics, right? Individual landowners, individual households doing it, there's a lot of precedent for that. There's also precedent for municipalities elevating the public realm first and then asking their ratepayers to come up to them. Either way, the issue becomes who's the first mover and the period of time before everyone gets on the same elevation again. Particularly in Essex, on the backside where it's very low and wet, we did some studies there where it would seem prudent for housing to begin to elevate itself. What's elegant about that is that individual landowners, individual homeowners, individual families can make those decisions. Mortgage brokers and bankers can decide about the risk tolerance and the viability of that. And it's at an increment or scale where you can do this over time. And there are many case studies in the work that we've done of looking at armoring, bolstering, elevating. There's a whole menu of those kinds of things. And what I like about that approach is it's not top down. It's kind of offering to people, in addition to these physical case studies about building, we would also need, finance and insurance logic and help and support. But I could imagine something like that being very effective, especially in the low-lying places where the housing is not so elevated already. The second point has to do with the inland properties that you mentioned, right? So we do have recommendations both in terms of agriculture, forestry, but also in terms of housing, sites for housing that are already more inland, that are on the mainland, in which there is potential there, we think, for doing something smart.
Can I follow up on these housing questions and ask you, kind of, since you are a landscape expert, if you were trying to portray what housing would look like. You mentioned a few things, like we're missing the missing middle and we're too far down on the coast. So if you took Cape Ann, because I know in your report you do speak of the kind of buildings that there would be, the size and the energy, whatever. So, because I think that, Ruth, you've been involved in these in a long time. I think the community, at least of Gloucester, recognizing that something in that missing middle is really important to focus on. So going out, if there were regenerative housing, what would this housing look like and where would it be located and what are the features of the units and the way they're constructed and all that? Can you give us your vision, not just build more housing, but what would it look like and where would it be located?
Sure, yeah. We did a course 2 years ago now with graduate students looking at the identity of housing on Cape Ann, a kind of survey, because with the tools we have now, you can get a kind of Google Street View or a real estate listing of the mugshot, can I say mugshot? The face of the building of almost every house on Cape Ann. The big properties, maybe you can't get the front door, but we had a very good data set, thousands and thousands of homes, and the student was able to isolate a kind of Cape Ann style, right? This was important to us because what we find in our work in other places is that adapting to rising seas and living with the water it's doable, it's physics, we have a lot of history doing this. But often what's lost is the character of the place. That's what's vulnerable, right? Because if you put all of a sudden, if we're on stilts, we look like North Carolina or Louisiana or Florida, and that's not Cape Ann. We're on granite on Cape Ann, right? So at one end, we can talk about Cape Ann style, and we have good detail on the kinds of housing that's here. Having said that, if you're building something that's more of a couple of attached houses or a couple of apartment blocks, that's quite different, right? Where to think about it going, we have good detailed evaluation of that. Having said that, the marketplace is probably the right place to decide what its style should be. Of course, it's not in keeping with Cape Ann. We would not recommend doing things that are tall. We should do things that are in keeping with the scale and the character that's here. And this is a traditional kind of form-based code that's used elsewhere around the country. It's not that complicated. Having said that, the marketplace and the development community will have a say in this, right? Because it's private capital most often that's going to be, doing this kind of development work.
Although you explain those market forces in the beginning as a tendency to build really big houses and then low rent apartment buildings or something, and there is that missing middle that we can't just rely on the developers and the markets necessarily, can we? So, all right. Anyone else have any comments about housing or anything else? Tom?
So if we don't want houses on stilts or ultimately elevated roadways to get to those houses, going back to your earlier comment about stop building in the floodplain, what can we do in light of the local limitations on zoning, politics, and mass general law restrictions on what we can do? What sort of zoning can we have to at least discourage, if not prevent, future construction?
Yeah, it's an important. I think you've laid out the nexus of relationships there, right? It's kind of this tough knot where we've got zoning, we've got neighborhood expectations. One element of that is that there is a certain increment, a certain amount of housing that can be built as of right now, and a part of that has to do with a culture in which people, we're not all going to agree, but in which people agree to like, it's going to be okay to build a little bit more housing. And I just find everywhere I work, and certainly here, enormous opposition to the idea. Enormous, enormous opposition. And I just think that's not going to solve everything, but let's start there, right? Let's start with that basic sense of should we have housing for people or not, and given the, the relationship between that and climate. Plans are made, zoning ordinances and planning decisions are made all the time, and that's a political economy. And I know it's not always easy in the context of a town meeting or in the context of a referendum or in the context of our representatives in the State House. Having said that, those mechanisms are there to be responsive. And so I would start first with the idea that we can build as of right, and we need to incentivize that to the extent we can, and to normalize support for that, to make it socially acceptable for me to go to a meeting and say, I think we need some more housing. Now, we haven't studied exactly how many units that is or how many houses that is, but there is definitely the capacity here, given the infrastructure that's here to support that. Secondly, with respect to changing policy, planning, zoning, all of those things are ongoing processes. And in each of the municipalities, they can tell you more explicitly what they're dealing with, et cetera. But it begins with a civil society desire to grow. And what we've seen is a real resistance to that growth. As it's being seen as negative, it's not seen as desirable. And at the same moment, compared to a lot of the other places that I study, there is enormous capacity here. The last thing that I'll say is that oftentimes, the development community, to the extent they're local or regional, right? These are developers. If they have a sense that they're walking into a place in which everything that they do is going to be seen to be hostile, they're probably going to be disincentivized. And that's a part of the public response, is to disincentivize developers from coming. To the extent we can engage in those conversations in a way, to the extent we share any values, if we agree that there's a certain kind of housing that we want to grow, that's how I would think about that. But I wouldn't write off the planning and zoning as a done deal. I think it goes back to this question of trust and a level of access with the people that are making those decisions.
So I think, Charles, you're saying that these climate changes could force us to think much bigger about the way that we do housing. Anyone else? Ruth, housing.
This is not necessarily a question, but the word growth does not mean more people. It just means the addition of more units to house the people that we now can't house, because that middle group is becoming more and more unhoused or doesn't have the available space for them to be housed that's affordable to them. So it's not necessarily more people, everyone in the room. Don't be scared. I live on a street, and I live in a conforming house, a conforming piece of land. And down the street from me, there's a development that was done in the late 50s to 1965. There are about 200 houses, maybe 175. It was a tree farm. And it's all 6,500, 6,700 square foot lots. Now you're required to have 10,000 square foot lot. And so the builder could be a homeowner. It doesn't always mean the word developer. It's not a bad word. Can't afford to build a house that the middle people can afford. So they build a bigger house because they need to get more money to recoup the land acquisition. And that includes a garage, and maybe it includes a primary bath and all kinds of amenities at a higher price point. So zoning is really important to this conversation. One of the things you said that I loved was about the relationship between state and municipalities. One of the things the state of Massachusetts did was to enhance its Title V law in the mid-1990s to require inspection of every septic system on transfer. Now, the North Gloucester was completely sewered over a 6-year period, and that was under a federal mandate. And now you can swim in the Annisquam River and in the Mill River. I mean, that was a great way, because somebody used the word pollution, because it all matters in housing. But the other side of that is I just sold a house where it was $100,000 to replace a septic system for a 2-bedroom house. So it's been a very painful transition over the last 30 years for the homeowner. Not saying it shouldn't have been done, because it's about pollution. So I appreciate that you did this today and that your conversation is focusing on housing. And the common denominator in the room today is gray hair. And I don't mean to say it's a bad thing if you have gray hair, but it just demonstrates that we're probably all housed. And and There was a recent application before the Board of Appeals that the owner asked me if I would speak, only from a zoning reform advocacy. And it was about taking 3 small lots and combining them into a conforming lot to put an additional 4 units on and making a total of 6 units. Perfect description of urban living. And it passed unanimously. And more of us need to step up to the podium and say yes.
Thank you.
Say that some of the meetings already, we are all gray-haired, but I'm finding massive interest in the gray-haired about their children and their grandchildren. And so it's not just self-interest, it's the multi-generational that could move the city to create more of that.
Standing up and saying yes.
Yeah. Anyone else have something? Greg?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for this forum. I want to pick up on the theme of saying yes, or at least the incrementalism and the power of all of us in this room. I've spent almost 40 years managing small towns, and I will tell you that, at least at a small town level, if 2 or 3 people came to a select board meeting and said something in unison, that typically carried the night. So don't underestimate your ability to speak up and say, this is what I want, or I think this is what should happen. Part of the NIMBYism that seems to dominate so much is often because people are surprised by it. They don't feel engaged in it. They don't feel like they had a voice in what was being proposed. And I think we can do a much better job doing that. And I think that is a way for us to reclaim our civic space and to relearn how to govern ourselves. We are so divisive right now because of that lack of engagement. I really believe that. I really feel that if we as individuals come to the table, express our opinions early on, and the leaders want that. They need that. They want that feedback. They often don't get it. They often get the tomato throwers at the 11th hour. That's what we typically see. So step up.
So in that regard, Greg, thanks for mentioning 2 things. To remind you again that Monday, March 23rd, in this room, City is holding a housing meeting, and they're looking for all of your thoughts. So try to come to that meeting and speak up as you're suggesting. Also, if you didn't sign in, please do that, and we'll try to engage with all of you, maybe have another meeting at some point or other, so we'll see. Yes, Christine.
I have 2 points. Can you hear? I find this mushy. One is that in in Rockport, we have had a drought for several years and not enough water. So how you increase housing and increase population when there's not enough water to water my mature oak tree, which is a benefit for the environment. You know, you kill trees if you don't water them. That's one. The other is I lived in Charlestown for 30 years and watched the population density soar because when I moved there were single families that turned into, one single family would turn into 3 to 4 condos. The density there was, to be mild about it, it's unpleasant. People were at each other's throats about parking, for one thing, but it's there has to be a way to solve this. But I think that there are some more issues that we haven't really discussed here, and I don't think that housing is really important. But you really have to have the environment that supports it, and also there's a traffic issue that we have in Rockport. You add more and more, and then what do you do with that? You just get more traffic.
Choices and sacrifices. Jerry.
So many of the issues being brought up here rest on financial decisions to be made in the future. Has there been any work done to measure opportunity cost or value proposition to formulate the effects of what may lie ahead?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great point. So the first thing to say there is if you look at kind of scenario planning for climate adaptation, most of the studies that are done, most of the estimates are kind of probabilistic models on one parcel of land. So if you're an owner of one property, campus, an institution, a physical plant, or a house. With probabilistic models, you can predict more or less with some accuracy the tools that are available today. Our mandate was more horizontal, kind of looking across civil society. And Keenan's chapter, his contributions have looked at that relative to comparables elsewhere. They've looked also at the kind of finance structure in the 4 municipalities. What we have not done is we haven't done a kind of soup to nuts bottom line tallying up the whole number. But Keenan and Rachel Meltzel do get at many of those topics and with examples from elsewhere can estimate. It's a big number. I try to disaggregate it by saying that it's not going to be one single big project, but there is clearly in the literature the communities that begin to have conversations like this, that begin to make decisions and plan and set priorities, they're in a much better position when extreme events happen. They resist being federalized by FEMA. They tend to respond more healthily. But they also, because of that planning process, have the ability to have made decisions ahead of time. And those communities that don't make those choices find in the literature that often other actors have already made choices. I think the focus on the financial side of it is helpful here because for most for most Americans, you know, their household is their home is their single biggest asset. And that's not always the case here on Cape Ann, but often it is true. And therefore, maintaining a homeowners association or a zoning bylaw that says, well, you have to have a 10,000 square foot lot is a part of their economic resilience plan. So there's a rationale behind it. It's not just an irrational fear of others. There's an economic self-interest there. But we have enough examples in the study of how to think about that and how to change over time those kinds of incentives. It's not just based on the financial implication, but the financial outcome obviously has a big say. So I tend to think of it as a lot of individuals and institutions looking at their bottom line and making individual decisions. But when you look at something like $100,000 for one septic system for a property, and then you multiply that times the thousands of houses, you know, you've got a systemic problem of decisions that were made 50 years ago.
Thank you, Charles, for addressing after a hurricane. I don't know if you quite use the word post-disaster planning, but in your reports, you point out that the greatest extreme threat in your work was shown to be a hurricane coming back if it roared into the harbor and all along the coast and the bridges down and infrastructure destroyed. It's a massive undertaking to rebuild. And at that point, it's good to have in place plans for big solutions. So, for example, Ruth, coming out of a post-disaster epoch, in order to avoid the worst of consequences, which are typically massive gentrification and driving out of longtime residents that don't have the financial reserves. At that point, you point out in your report, you might develop community land trusts or cooperative housing solutions for sort of pulling your community together to help each other out, mutual aid. And at some point, is it worth thinking about those bigger solutions now in order to prepare for when these sea level rise extreme storms come? So thanks for bringing up do you want to add to post-disaster planning?
Yeah, I mean, the experts in risk and resilience talk about slow and fast disasters, right? And almost always, it's not just a natural phenomenon, it's the impact of natural phenomenon on infrastructure that's been made by humans, right? So that's that combination. The use of a scenario of a storm is helpful in focusing the mind, but it's not the only outcome that's here, right? So we do know that if there's only 2 bridges and a railroad and the traffic circle to get onto the bridge is underwater, that's a place I would tend to focus my interest. And we use the scenario about disaster recovery because it allows it to focus on health and life safety as a kind of emergent issue. It's like, well, we know that Essex has a fire station that's on one side of the river, and getting across to the other side at a moment of extremity is kind of important, right? So that's a good way in for most audiences, for most publics to think about it. To the extent you can make decisions ahead of an extreme event, all the literature and all the case studies tell us that you'll be in a better position to respond once that event happens. And the good news there is that much of this work is already happening. I've found in my conversations and my work here, all the 4 municipalities, as well as the emergency responders, are focused and responsive, and they're highly professional, and they want to do the right thing. It's when we get into infrastructural systems that make that challenging, right? When we have to go to the state to elevate the bridge and we only do it by 16 inches and not 2 feet, it's in that kind of increment of, well, is it worth rebuilding the wastewater treatment plant at that elevation, or should we plan how far out? It's the fact that each one of those are taken on different timelines, those choices, that's where things get really complicated in the built environment.
I think that you mentioned Jesse Keenan's book North, where he points out there is no safe place in the United States now. And on Cape Ann, we could have a Nashville, we could have a Maui, we could have a North Carolina coast, and it's worth thinking about how we would respond and prepare for the extreme storms that could actually happen. Let me call on any others first.
Hi. I was wondering, a two-part question. I was wondering, is the money that we're going to need to pay for our future going to come in some very large percentage out of real estate taxes? Or is there another revenue source that you foresee? For instance, I did some calculations and some modeling with this recent Hernando and came up with quasi-good numbers based on what Vineyard Wind was producing. And asked about the 3 OCSA areas, floating farms off of closest to Gloucester. And the numbers said that there was $1 million an hour in electricity that would have been coming ashore if we'd had those operational, the wind farms operational. That's one part of the question is what's the source of the revenue? And the other one is, is there a correlation between what you call the floodplain, or what is called the floodplain, and topo lines onshore? Because I think our zoning is pretty much based on topo lines, right?
Yeah, thanks for that. Greg will remind me that, overwhelmingly the municipalities, revenue sources come from property taxes, individuals, institutions paying that. What Keenan looks at in his work is, the increasing effects of weather events, not even extreme, just kind of normal everyday climate change. And as that impacts those property values, there are scenarios where one could enter into, I don't like this phrase, but he calls it a kind of doom loop, where the impact on housing is such that those properties can't pay the revenue, and then the revenue base shrinks. And I find that a little bit catastrophic, but it's his work, and he's an expert in this field. Right now, it's an open question where funding, and I would say there's a menu of different possibilities, right? There's one scenario where, we appeal to the state and say, listen, you have to let us increase our increment of property taxation to be able to anticipate these challenges. That seems unlikely in our political economy, but that's one scenario. Another scenario is something like, whether it's a kind of collaboration among municipalities or something like the Massachusetts Tollway, a kind of overlay authority that says, in these coastal zones, we have to be able to generate revenue, and here's how we might do that. Of course, it's possible that the State House and or the federal government could intervene. It's equally possible that private philanthropic efforts step up and say that there will be a fund or a trust, right? So we do some studies looking at precedents for land trusts where people decide to bequeath their property in service of coastal resilience. Again, that's not for me to say, that's for you to decide. But in each of those examples, there are scenarios where additional revenues could be found. But overwhelmingly, our experts are advising, start to think about growth now, while you're also looking at those revenue possibilities. Yeah, we look at a range of data. So there's the FEMA floodplain, there's the kind of coastal inundation zone, and there's a variety of other measures. And most of them do correspond more or less to some topographic reality. We also use the lands that were filled, irrespective of elevation. If it's filled land, it will tend to subside more often. So you'll see in our study, we've got 4 or 5 of those overlays. When you study a storm model, initially that's what happens, and then things get weird at a point where water goes in ways that you don't expect it to. but that happens only with really quite extreme events and with a period of inundation. So by and large, what's called a bathtub model, what you can find in the state model, the tool that they have where you can look at your coastal zone and see and evaluate risk, that kind of both publicly available information and information in the marketplace to mortgage brokers and bankers and insurance companies, that's kind of normative these days. And so a bathtub model of pure elevation is not a bad place to start. From there, we then look in two directions. There's the legal designation that the FEMA floodplain is not exactly just topo, it's also negotiated and gerrymandered around the edges a little bit here and there every time it's re-released. And then once you push it through a hydrodynamic model, you get a more nuanced and complex understanding of it. The tools that are out there now that are widely available are quite good, actually.
Marcia.
I don't want to detract from that much more in-depth conversation, but I'm wondering if you could, I would love to see more small and smart housing built in Gloucester. It's definitely sorely needed. But what are some of the things that people could advocate for when that housing is built that would make it better in the future in terms of the climate?
Sure, yeah, I think as Greg has mentioned, one of the things that I quite like about working here is you lovely folks, but also like we can get our heads around the whole place. Like we literally can look at every building and there's a sense of having a granular understanding of the scale of it. And so if 5 people turn up at a meeting and say, listen, these are our values, what I see and what I hear is that has an impact. It's not going to win the day every time, but at the same time, it's at a scale where civilian participation in these processes still matters. There's a long history of that. And of course, in the places that have town meeting, it's very direct. That's quite special because most of the states don't have that, right? I like the formulation of smart and small. There can be things that are medium-sized or bigger, but the key idea is that most of the rules and regulations have been built to protect us from doing that, right? You have to have, for any kind of walk-up building, you have to have 2 stairs. So every housing advocate I know around the country is now piloting a single stair walk-up that's equally safe in terms of fire, right? So if we can get away from the 10,000-foot requirement in a property, if we can in fact have fewer parking requirements, we're fighting the last war, basically. Like we have all of these things that will require us to build more robustly, bigger, take up more resources, and we're in a different place now. And so I think there's some reform there around building codes and individual requirements in terms of zoning.
I was really on a more practical idea like having solar-ready hookups and having the requirement that EV chargers are put into new, that I can't list all of them, but I know maybe Lisa Smith could, or maybe you could
Sure, yeah.
put that in mind.
Yeah, sure. Sure, yeah. So as I've said, like our recommendation is to try to build housing in a smart way, put it in the right places where it's not increasing the vulnerability, put it in places and at a scale that's commensurate with the surroundings, and whether it's maintaining the existing population in a better, more resilient housing or whether it's growing slightly, in either case, thinking about the economic input of that would be a first order question. If we can do that in a way that decarbonizes the system, even better. If we can do that in a way that allows it to be off the grid in a storm, even better. I mentioned earlier Derek Thompson, and he's got this concept of everything bagel liberalism. And I don't mean to, speak to your politics. I'm not here to show you my politics. But his point is that often when we try to do the right thing and build something, we layer it up with all of these other requirements. And the example in the book, Abundance, has to do with the kind of onshoring of chip manufacturing in the U.S. So Biden administration signs this bill, and they produce this incentive to bring chip production back to the United States. And the list of other requirements is voluminous. And they're all good things. On-site daycare, women workforce housing. And I don't mean to in any way suggest that that's not desirable, but it has the effect of, in fact, disincentivizing the thing that we're trying to incentivize. So as I think of the priorities of housing and climate vulnerability on Cape Ann, if we can do it, in a way that's smart and green and solar, great. But I don't want that to be the impediment to actually building it.
Others like to add comments and thoughts? Yeah.
Did you come up with any metric of like how at risk Cape Ann is for fires? And the other part is all this studying of just making all our insurance rates go up? Because it seems like that's the only thing that's coming out of it.
Thank you for that. On the first point, are you properly housed, sir? Excellent. Okay. Let's start there. No, thanks for that. On the question of fire, the short answer is no. We know of reports and studies that have been done. When we look at the relative vulnerabilities, the relative drought and fire, it's on the list, but it's in the double digits before you get to fire, in my estimation. Of course, it's important. Having said that, we have people that are, there are people on the ground that are concerning themselves with this, and it's not been a primary area for our study. On the second one, I'm happy to say, I don't think anything academic from Harvard is going to affect reinsurance markets. I don't think they're paying any attention to us, would be the short version.
Jesse Keenan, maybe.
He's the guy on Morning Joe and C-SPAN.
He's on Morning Joe, right. So, but he was up here. How about that? Anyone else? Chris, you
Well, that's quite an introduction for a start. In Charles's excellent presentation, the emphasis quite logically and understandably was on the coast, okay? And I think we're all aware, living here, that if there was one of these major catastrophic events, a major hurricane, and we can all foresee that possibly in our future, or at least our children's future, or whatever, speaking as a gray hair. And one of my concerns is, okay, so let's think about the idea that, yes, there is one of these disasters, God forbid, or whatever, and a lot of residential and commercial infrastructure is destroyed and is not replaceable in the same coastal areas. So where are they going to rebuild? And if you looked at the maps that were shown multiple times, there's one very conspicuous area that's kind of open and apparently available for that kind of development. It's called Dogtown. Over 3,000 acres. And I think a lot of people, even on Cape Ann, even people who enjoy Dogtown, kind of think that it's kind of, oh yeah, that's protected. That's all fine, and don't worry about Dogtown. It's whatever. It's not. It has some level of protection because most of it is city-owned, has watershed acreage protection or whatever, but most of it is unprotected in the way that trustees of reservations or greenbelt property is protected. So there it sits, and when the right bad conditions occur, I cannot believe that responsible officials and citizens or whatever are going to say, oh, well, no problem, we'll just start building in Dogtown. And there is precedent. I think someone mentioned earlier that there was a development there starting in 1904 or something, and fortunately going down the tubes by 1917. But it was a major development. There was an airstrip planned there at one point, et cetera. So it's by no means whatever. And I just want to, from my own personal point of view, and hopefully from others as well, this is not just a piece of open space. I would argue, and I've spent a lot of time studying the place and making lists of little organisms and big organisms and things like that. This is one of the most significant, and especially significant, unprotected open spaces, not just in Eastern Mass, not just in Essex County, not just in Massachusetts, but certainly region-wide. I'll give you one semi-humorous example of that, and that is that there's studies from the Natural Heritage Program in Massachusetts several studies have done studies on the moth fauna, and you might go, well, moths, who cares? They eat my clothes or whatever. There are over 300 species of moths that have been identified in Dogtown, and the people that have been doing that indicate that every time they went in to study the moths at different seasons and whatever, different techniques, they've found, oh, there's a whole lot more, and they indicate that there could be double that number. Now, I'm not saying that as the president of the moth fan club necessarily. I like moths. If you could see the whole spectrum of moths, they're not all little brown things, although quite a lot of them are. I'm just giving you an indication of the general biodiversity of the place. And that's reflected in many things, in the plants, in the dragonflies, and the butterfly, the vernal pools, et cetera, et cetera. It has rare habitats that are crammed with rare species, and that's something that I don't think a lot of people, take to heart necessarily. And the other thing that I would say about it is, again, Charles' reference to management and whatever. These things, these natural areas, do not just let nature take its course. BS. Okay? These places all have to be managed. The way nature used to manage them is that they were unmanaged, but there were natural fires, natural floods, natural things, and that's how biodiversity develops. These days, we don't allow those kinds of things to happen for the most part, and so we have to encourage them a little bit with things like controlled burns or other things that allow the vegetation that comes in after the burns. Those things also support the general biodiversity. So that's just my pitch for Dogtown and biodiversity.
Thanks for that. It's an extraordinary cultural landscape of enormous value, immeasurable value. In addition to its value as habitat, it's also home to a municipal compost pile, and among other uses. And its precarity is something that's not widely understood. Its value is, I think, understood. Its use is growing, and yeah, we have some thoughts about that. And there's no scenario where you couldn't build more housing and also maintain and enhance Dogtown. These things are not, they're not contradictory.
Thank you, Chris, for reminding. I think that this is the words coming, contested terrain. All of Cape Ann is contested going forward. And you brought up, Christine, there are so many conflicting pressures that make these things not easy solutions. It's all contested when we live here on this beautiful place that's under enormous stress now and increasing. And I think this is the point that you also made, is that if we in this community are going to make hard choices about this contested terrain and values, we're going to have to find ways to talk to each other better than we have been doing in a while. So, yeah. All right, thank you for your last word. And thank you all for coming. Please sign up at the sheet, take the flyers, and maybe we'll see you again here. Thank you.